Well, hi to everyone tuning in tonight on Zoom and Facebook. Welcome back to Rabble's Off the Hill political panel. I'm Libby Davies, your co-host for this month's Off the Hill, and I'm joining you from the unconquered territories of the Seminole people. I'm joined by my co-host, Robin Browne.
Thanks, Libby. Hi, everyone. I'm joining you from the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people, where I was out today picketing with the folks from the Public Service Alliance of Canada. So we give them a shout out, my brothers and sisters.
Solidarity to our union allies and friends. Well, thanks very much, Robin. And this month on Off the Hill, we're diving into the muddy waters of corporate influence in the climate crisis. And as always, we have gathered a wonderful set of panelists to offer their expert opinions. First, welcome to Off the Hill regular panelist, MP Leah Gazan. Leah, we're always so delighted that you show up and take time out of your busy schedule on Parliament Hill and your riding. Leah has been the NDP Member of Parliament for Winnipeg Centre since 2019 and is currently the NDP critic for children, families and social development, as well as the critic for women and gender equality and deputy critic for housing. Leah is a member of the Wood Mountain Lakota Nation located in Saskatchewan Treaty 4 territory. So hello, Leah. Next, we have Diana Yoon. Diana, welcome back. Diana is a climate and housing justice activist based in Toronto and is currently organizing with Climate Justice Toronto. Professionally, Diana works at the intersection of climate mitigation and affordable housing. She holds a Master's of Arts in Critical Human Geography from York University and was formerly the Geography Grad Student Department Steward for QP 3903. Welcome, Diana. And rounding out our panel tonight is Gordon Laxer. Gordon is a political economist and professor emeritus at the University of Alberta. He's also the author of the report, Posing as Canadian, How Big Foreign Oil Captures Canadian Energy and Climate Policy. Perfect for our topic tonight. Thank you so much for joining us, Gordon.
Nice to join you.
Great. Unfortunately, Chuka Ejekam had something come up at the last minute, and so he is unable to join us tonight, but I know we'll see him the next time. So welcome to all our panelists tonight, and a special welcome to all of you who registered for this panel on Zoom. We do encourage you to participate in the chat and ask questions to our panelists through the Q&A function, and we'll always do our best to get to your questions near the end of the show. For those of you watching on Facebook, hello, and a reminder that if you'd like to participate in future events, simply sign up to Rabble's free newsletter to get a notification for the Zoom invite. Just go to rabble.ca/subscribe. Now, before I turn it over to Robin, we do want to make a special note that, wow, this week is Rabble's 22nd birthday. Congratulations, Rabble. To celebrate this milestone, Rabble is giving special gifts to new donors. Please show your support if you can at rabble.ca/donate.
Thanks, Libby, and congratulations, Rabble. So, as mentioned, this month we'll be diving into corporate interference, or as it's sometimes called, corporate capture, and the climate crisis. How are these two concepts connected, and how can we move past our current status? So we're going to start with Gordon, but if other folks want to jump in afterwards, go ahead. But Gordon, your report, How Big Oil Captures Canadian Energy and Climate Policy, zeroes in on this key question of corporate influence in Canadian politics and policymaking. How entrenched is corporate control, and what harm is it doing?
It's great to be here. I join you from Robinson Treaty area in Central Ontario. Well, what sparked my interest into researching corporate capture by big oil was their outlandish campaign before Alberta's last provincial election regarding what they called a very well orchestrated, well-planned, foreign-funded attack on Canadian infrastructure, pipelines, LNG facilities. That was how Tim McMillan, the CEO of CAP, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, put it. CAP is the apex oil lobby group in Canada, and is the biggest obstacle to effective climate action, because it is the production rather than the consumption of oil and gas in Canada that's Canada's largest source of emissions. It's about a third of all emissions come from production of oil and gas. So you can't cut emissions by 40 to 45% in the next 6.5 years if you don't touch the emissions of the oil and gas industry. It's the biggest source. So it was crucial for me to research and refute CAP's fraudulent story. Now, CAP calls itself Canadian, gaily waves the maple leaf flag, and insinuates the Canadian environmentalists are traitors. Yet CAP is overwhelmingly foreign funded and foreign influenced itself. It uses the maple leaf flag as a fig leaf to cover its so much greater foreign funded, foreign influenced campaigns. CAP's call to shine light into the claim of a foreign funded campaign to shut down, quote, our industry was heard loud and clear by Jason Kenney, who announced that if elected, the United Conservative Party government would launch a war room and public inquiry to investigate foreign-funded anti-Alberta campaigns. Kenney headed the UCP into the 2019 Alberta election against the governing NDP led by Rachel Notley. The UCP won partly on the basis of this promise. What hypocrisy. Here was big foreign oil using lots of foreign funding to point fingers at a trickle of foreign money flowing to environmentalist tar sands campaign to curtail their harmful environmental impacts. Canadians need to hear what a fraud CAP's messaging is. So CAP's outsized foreign-funded meddling in Canadian elections far exceeded the impact of China's electoral interference in the 2019 and 2021 elections. The single-minded focus on China's meddling is sparking hate activity against Chinese Canadians who are not responsible for actions by the Chinese government. So let's shift the conversation. Big foreign oil's meddling is undermining Canadians' popular sovereignty to determine their own destiny. So Kenney, once he was elected, he appointed a forensic accountant, Steve Allen, to head a public inquiry. And by selecting a forensic accountant, it made it look like environmentalist actions were illegal. But Allen's inquiry found no improper or illegal activity and an annual flow of foreign money to the tar sands campaigns that was so little, it was less than the cost of the inquiry itself. And so embarrassed was that the inquiry was headed by a prominent certified accountant, the normally staid newspaper of the national accounting profession called it a shambolic fiasco of a public inquiry. So I researched how foreign-owned big oil in Alberta is. I knew it was a lot, but was surprised at just how foreign-owned big oil in Canada is. Foreign-owned means foreign-funded. And here they've been tossing around foreign-funded as some kind of epithet. So there has not been a majority Canadian-owned oil corporation in Alberta sands since Suncor took over Petro-Canada in 2009. My posing as Canadian report shows that CAP gets about 97% of its revenue from its foreign-owned corporate members, and it uses it to employ 36 full-time lobbyists who lobbied Canadian federal officials on an average of 5 times a day between 2011 and 2018. And the next year, in 2019, for the first time, CAP was allowed to register as a third-party advertiser. As such, in the 2019 election, it could spend up to $1.5 million before the election period and run ads supporting candidates and parties. Talk about meddling.
Gordon,
yeah.
Hold you for a second, because this is great stuff. And we're going to go to, in a second, to Diana to talk about how to counter corporate influence, specifically on the climate file. But this whole panel is a bit broader than that. So I want to bring other people in to talk about how entrenched corporate control is in general, if others want to comment on that. And specifically, mentioning what Gordon mentioned about this foreign influence thing. But do other folks want to talk about, again, corporate influence in general?
Well, just if you'd like me to contribute, Robin, you know, I mean, certainly we see in Canada right now. It's not just in Canada, but globally, uh, the privileges of corporations really overriding the human rights of people. We see this certainly in Canada on Indigenous territories. Wet'suwet'en territory is a case in point with LNG, and the fact that it seems that the corporation is privileges are usurping the rights of Indigenous peoples, and all governments are turning a blind eye to this kind of behavior. We have to remember that corporations are not rights holders, yet they seem to be privileged over the government's commitment to uphold the rights of certainly Indigenous peoples in Canada. And if you look at the current budget, and the focus of the current budget, it's on increased resource extraction in the country. Where's that coming from? Indigenous, it's going to be supported by Indigenous lands, territories, and resources, and there's no accountability to boot. Look at all the orphan wells across the country, big oil going into communities, causing all sorts of environmental damage, such a great cost, not just financial cost, but environmental cost, human rights cost, leaving without having to even clean up their mess. And so I think this is something that we really need to look at in this country. This is something that I have certainly called out regularly as an official, and I think it's a real problem, particularly if you look at this budget, which will privilege the corporate elite.
Thanks, Leah. And let's swing over to Diana now. And Diana, as we noted in your introduction, you're a climate activist, and no doubt this question of corporate influence and power must come up all the time. Exactly what Gordon has been speaking about, in fact, targeting environmental activists. So just 2 points, I guess, to you. What is your take on the influence of corporate lobbying and corporate power, particularly in Ottawa? And I think, interestingly, what strategies does the climate justice movement use to counter corporate influence?
Yeah, thanks, Libby. Great question. So, to kind of go off the first question to Gordon, I think I will spend the majority of my remarks talking about climate activist strategies and how what that looks like, and particularly targeting big oil. But I think when I look at like the work I do professionally in the climate sector and in kind of intersection in climate and housing, we also see the influence of corporate interests there. Like, for example, when there are new development standards to reduce emissions in buildings, which is another significant source of emissions in the country, there has been repeated incidents of lobbying from, housing developers against new efficiency standards. So, I think when we look at kind of the corporate control, there there has to be a real emphasis on understanding that green capitalism is really in play, that there are a lot of actors willing to capitalize on, okay, fine, like if this climate action stuff is trendy, if this is the direction we're going to go, then how can we still profit the most out of it? What are the ways that our companies can care as much as they can about that kind of profit, that bottom line? So, I think that there's lots to talk about in the nuance of, I guess, in the spectrum of climate action, where corporate control can be. But I really wanted to kind of focus on two main strategies. So, like Leah said, Indigenous solidarity is one kind of key strategy the climate justice movement uses to counter corporate influence, and the other is fossil fuel divestment. So, I think that climate justice movement activists really have to recognize that Indigenous, Black, and racialized communities have faced the worst impacts of the climate crisis and also have been on the front lines of fighting against natural resource extraction. Indigenous Climate Action had a report, Indigenous Resistance Against Carbon, which amplifies how resistance impacts the viability of fossil fuel expansion and ultimately reduces the carbon in our atmosphere. What that means is activists can have and need to continue supporting Indigenous land defenders. It's not, like Indigenous land defenders are separate from climate activists, and I think they often get lumped in the same into the same bucket. But I think it's really important to recognize that there's really, really incredible work happening by Indigenous land defenders. And one way to do that kind of solidarity, is to bring attention to some of these resistance actions across the country. So, in 2016, I participated in a civil disobedience on Parliament Hill in Ottawa against the Trans Mountain, formerly Kinder Morgan pipeline. That was bringing it from the west to Ottawa, to Parliament Hill. And that, raises awareness, makes it, is trying to hold governments accountable. More recently, activists have held rallies in downtown Toronto in front of bank headquarters in support of the Wet'suwet'en. So I think that kind of key piece of what does it look like, even if, you feel very far removed from Indigenous land defenders and your local communities, to amplify their work. I think, and then with fossil fuel divestment, I organize with Climate Justice Toronto locally now, but when I started, I was a undergrad student and I was part of the Queen's University campaign for fossil fuel divestment. Fossil fuel divestment as a whole, as a goal, works because it stigmatizes the fossil fuel industry. It kind of brings awareness of the hypocrisy of banks and of campuses, of all of the greenwashing, and to commitments that, corporations and institutions have towards sustainability and climate action, while actively courting, oil and gas sponsorships and donations and funding fossil fuel projects. So, I think that fossil fuel divestment has been a very effective strategy to start this conversation, to think about what it looks like to reinvest in clean energy and to get people involved in a way that feels tangible. Because, tackling like RBC, the biggest fossil fuel financer in the world, may not feel so tangible for an individual or for a community group.
Hey, great strategies, Diana. Thanks.
Yeah, no, thanks, Diana. Kind of following up from that, and again, this is a question to everybody now. What does it say about the state of Canadian politics that there's such a strong connection between the private interests of corporations and government policy versus the overall public interest? What can we do about this clear conflict of interest? Why don't we start with Gordon?
Well, we've seen, in the last 40 years, this whole ideology that, the market always knows it better and government should get out of the way. That it is terrible for the climate, because the private interests almost always, when they're making record profits, it's, especially in Canada, it's through resource extraction. It's always producing more stuff, and it's doing it in a very damaging way that doesn't necessarily support the workers and the communities where they're the employer. So we have to really get a much stronger sense that we have interests in common, that we share a commons. And this is the basis of democracy. Is it has to be the people that, I was a political economist, or I'm a political economist. What's an economy for? Whose economy is it? The economy should not be just for the rich to make money. It should be something that serves all of us. And we have to get to a place where that happens, and that is going to have a much lighter touch on the environment.
Thanks. Leah, you want to jump in on that one?
Well, I think, certainly the ballot box. We are at a critical juncture, I think, politically in this country. I think it's becoming more apparent, and people need to know who they're voting for and what they support. Like, I think it would be worth noting that the federal government has several meetings, meetings upon meetings with the oil lobbyists. They refuse to divest from fossil fuels in a real way. And I think Canadians need to, or voters, and whether you can vote or not, need to send a clear message that this isn't acceptable. I worry about the state of affairs of this country when we're not going after the ultra wealthy to pay their fair share. I know the NDP has focused a lot on Loblaws. He's one culprit. Galen Weston is one corporate culprit amongst many. And I would say, looking at certainly the oil and gas sector, and the kind of allowances that they're given by consecutive liberal and conservative governments. Quite frankly, they're the only parties that have governed in this country. I think it's time for people to take a pause. These are not parties of for the people. Corporations, when we're talking about whether it's climate, housing, these are not parties of the people or the worker, or the worker being exploited in the resource extraction industries. Certainly, parties that are supporting a great aggressive resource extraction, like the current Liberal government, profiting resource extraction companies. They're not also requiring those same companies to make sure, if you're going to exploit the natural resources, particularly on Indigenous lands, territories, and resources, you better have something in place to ensure that Indigenous women and girls are safe, because we know through the Status of Women Committee, there's a direct correlation between resource extraction and increased violence against Indigenous women and girls. And whether you agree with resource extraction or not, women and girls and diverse gender folks have a right to safety and security. So we all currently have a government that's saying we're going to exploit our natural resources, not talking about the fundamental human rights of Indigenous peoples, not talking about the safety of Indigenous women, girls, and diverse gendered people. We need to take a moment of pause, and we need to tell elected officials and tell governments what we think at the ballot box.
I think to Leah's point, like I'm really hearing like, do our governments care about putting people before profit, right? And making sure that people are protected, making sure that I guess that is the public interest, right? And when I see governments continue, like the federal government continuing fossil fuel subsidies, that I think we often hear, well, where is the money for X, Y, and Z? And I think that that is one example of where the public interest gets eroded to benefit private corporations. And because I guess, like Gordon said, this is all getting lobbied.
Yeah. And well, just coming back to Leah, Leah, you mentioned just a moment ago that it's important that we tell elected officials what we think at the ballot box. And it made me think, what do we do in between that? So a couple questions back to you. You did touch on, how powerful corporate lobbying is and its influence on Parliament Hill. So a couple questions. What protection do we have against excessive corporate influence on the Hill, and what protections do we still need? I mean, are there laws in place about lobbying that give us some protection, or is it something that's just totally inadequate?
Well, I mean, there's ethics codes. Certainly, we hear about them being violated on a daily in the House of Commons right now.
Yeah,
It's
true.
like as members of Parliament, we have to follow. We have very strict ethics rules. I don't think they're strict enough for corporations, quite frankly.
Isn't there meant to be
There's
something
a lobby registry,
lobbyists?
so you can keep track of, we have to report on which lobbyists came to see us about what. But it doesn't control how many. So if you look at the current environment minister, look up how many times the oil lobby has given him visits. How many meetings has he had with the oil lobby? So and I think it's certainly problematic. The other thing that's really problematic goes back to Harper when he changed the election laws, the election rules. We need, if you want to support a democracy, you have to invest in that democracy. Parties like the NDP, where, we're not getting big funding from our corporate friends. We're not a party of big corporations. We never have been. But the conservatives certainly are, and the liberals certainly are. And, we pay for elections through fundraising, and I've often said, my elections have been bought and paid for by the movement, from people across the country, in the climate justice movement and human rights movement. Other people have bought their elections through the corporate elite, or like we saw Pierre Poilievre did a fundraiser with the Frontier Center on a day where one of the lead residential school denialists, a big right-wing think tank, supporter of the oil and gas, spewing a lot of anti kind of feminist rhetoric, did a fundraiser with them. That's who's funding his campaigns. So, I think we need to be honest and upfront about, how parties are funded. When you interfere with the amount of money that goes back to parties, you give power to those that are fraternizing with the big corporations, and that's certainly not the New Democratic Party. But it certainly has a history in the Liberal and Conservative Party, because they're constantly debating in the House of Commons who's the biggest ethics breaker on any given day. That was today's debate, and that's most of the debate in House of Commons these days.
I was thinking that one thing we could certainly encourage people to do as individuals is to go to their member of parliament and say, who lobbies you? And actually get them to disclose it on an individual basis, find out, who it is that's getting to your elected member of parliament. If it's not you, who is it? And so that's one simple thing that people could do.
You know what? I absolutely agree. Like, I mean, the electorate has a right to know who your member of parliament is meeting with, what they're meeting with them. And we're supposed to disclose those things. I'm very careful about who I meet with, paying for my own stuff. These things are really important, ethically important, when you're holding positions of public office. And unfortunately, as we see in the House of Commons, we see people breaking those ethics rules all the time. And that's problematic.
Libby, I think it also has a dual benefit if residents are meeting with their elected officials. They're leveling the playing field, right? That's time that you're talking to that a lobbyist is not.
Exactly.
Yeah.
The oil lobbyists, as I said, were met 5 times a day. This is between 2011 and 2018, 5 times a day with federal government officials. And we know through who was meeting with whom, at least those, there's a certain level of federal official where it has to be public. But there's also secret committees. At the beginning of COVID, a lot of us were stuck at home, but not the oil industry. They set up in 2020, the spring of 2020, they set up a secret committee that met weekly with Sean Messel-Reagan, who was the Minister of Natural Resources, and a bunch of deputy ministers. This was Suncor, Cenovus, Petronas, all foreign-owned oil companies, and they had a whole agenda of what they would do, and they won a whole bunch of tax breaks and other things. They didn't. The federal government did not meet with environmentalists. They did not meet with citizens groups, with activists. They did not have committees like, they just met with the oil industry, and the oil industry got at least half of what they were demanding. So that there's also secret lobbying as well as, the official lobbyists. And CAP has 36. Can you imagine? They saturate the intellectual environment of federal civil servants, of top, deputy ministers and ministers, and they, they seem to be getting their way a lot.
Before we just go to the next question, I just wanted to just pick up on this and thank you for that, Gordon. Just back to Diana for a second, because Diana, when I saw your bio and it said you work at the intersection of climate change and affordable housing, I wanted to ask you about that. Like, talk a bit more about what that is, but you already touched on it, because you mentioned that corporations are lobbying against efficiency standards for new buildings. Actually, I'm not even sure if that's related to affordable housing, but if you could speak a bit more about that connection between climate change and affordable housing, and then specifically this idea of corporations are lobbying against efficiency standards. So we asked you earlier, how does a climate, how do you fight against that? Is the idea to stop them from doing that, go into the lobby ourselves? Or, so I guess two questions there, right?
Yeah, I think, one of the things, like, especially municipally, this has come up, like, Toronto is going through a by-election right now, but even in the last municipal election, looking at the influence of developers, like housing developers, and how that plays out, in city councilors. Acorn did a report where 35% of elected officials in the previous 2018 election had money deemed from what their metrics were as a development related donation. And so, when we know that the housing crisis is a major issue in cities, and that is a large source of where their donations are coming from, what does that say, right? And I think that's very similar to the things we've talked about in terms of, if the people who are making climate policy, whether what the emissions cap should be, for example, for different sectors of a different energy sector, then I think there's a lot of nuance there to kind of understand. Yes, this may seem indirect, but there can be a bias, right? And I think that's one of the things I've looked at in terms of like housing activism. I think particularly just, I guess, on efficiency standards, like in my master's, I looked at the city of Boulder's case. This feels random, but I am answering your question. And they put the onus on landlords that before they could rent out their units, they had to meet like a minimum energy efficiency standard. And if they didn't, then they couldn't rent out their units. So while ultimately it only meant that, 35% or 32% of rental units had to go through some sort of minor upgrade, usually the average cost of the upgrade was $33,000, like insulating attics or crawl spaces. There was huge opposition from the landlord association in Boulder, which meant that the compliance period was pushed back from 3 years to 8. So, I think that's an example of where you can see, things that seem fairly minor, things that would really benefit people, can get delayed and can get deterred.
Okay, thanks. All right, shifting gears a little bit, a question for everybody. The pandemic and George Floyd's murder spawned like big pushes for equity, diversity, equity, and inclusion that are now being met with equally strong backlash against all things labeled woke, right? Including climate action, right, which is being labeled woke. So what's the role of corporations in this massive backlash? Why don't we start with you again, Dan? We'll go backwards.
Sure, Robin. Do you want to tell us more about this backlash? Is there like specific examples you've heard?
Oh, sure. So if people are familiar with Jordan Peterson, for example, right, the University of Toronto psychology professor, massively popular. He's big. One of his big things is he's totally against diversity, equity, inclusion. In fact, he calls it, he reverses the words and calls it diversity, inclusion, and equity, and uses the acronym DIE, right? And he is now on a stadium tour because he's so popular attacking equity, right? So and right now, like the people who are getting the biggest attack are trans people, but it's a general post-pandemic attack on equity across the board, and things being labeled woke, including climate change, right? So the question is, do corporations have any role in this backlash, creating it, supporting it, not supporting it?
And just to add to that, Robin, for Diana to think about this, I mean, even corporations such as social media platforms, right, like Google and Facebook and other places that give enormous space for this kind of backlash to take place. It's often, very minimally moderated, or it just rages ahead. So I think that's what we're trying to get at is, what's the corporate involvement in this kind of massive backlash that includes climate action?
Yeah.
There's, sorry,
Go ahead, Gordon.
Yep.
certainly big oil, big foreign oil has had a big impact on creating AstroTurf fake grassroots groups. They were involved. They found by about 2014 that the environmentalists were winning the public relations battle on the tar sands. The tar sands had appeared on National Geographic. You see the picture, just incredibly, it looks like Mordor. And so the oil industry used to use just regular advertising, mainstream media. So then they brought in a guy from their big brother organization in the United States, the Petroleum Institute, which represent the same big oil companies. And he said, you got to have a ground game. You got to set up, you have to go into social media. You've got to set up these fake AstroTurf groups. So the CAP set up something called the Canadian Energy Citizens. They're waving the flag. They took the name Energy Citizens from the American Petroleum Institute, which had Energy Citizens. So they just took the word Canada in front of it, and they waved the Canadian flag. And they backed groups like the Yellow Vesters, and but it got out of control, and the groups that they had fomented were the ones that started the convoy. So they were actually very involved, and it was, racist, was anti-immigrant, that kind of stuff to some extent got out of control of the oil companies. They weren't crazy about those messages, but they started those groups. You remember Tamara Leach, one of the leaders of the convoy? Do you remember her? You can't have photographs in court, but that picture of her in court, and she's got "I love oil and gas." You remember that, the heart shape of? So that again came out of these AstroTurf groups that the oil companies have subsidized and supported, and they were using this fake nationalism to put down their opponents. So the big oil was very much central to that.
Diana, do you want to jump in on it?
Yeah, for sure. So National Observer did a investigation last year. 1 in 5 bank board of directors also sits on a bank of a fossil fuel company. Keep that in mind as I go through this example. So, RBC was found to be the biggest financer of fossil fuel projects in the last year. And at their annual general meeting, even if like RBC has diversity, equity, inclusion initiatives internally, even if they get awards for being like a top employer, Indigenous land defenders that had the right to be at the shareholders meeting, had votes, had proxy votes, have said that there was kind of other RBC shareholders and executives continued colonial violence against them. They felt like they were following the process that needed to be followed to kind of oppose some of the projects that RBC was putting forward. But, we kind of see that it is a little bit just talk, right? And actions there, this is very upsetting and very frustrating to know that, people like have tried to follow the process that the RBC had for their shareholders meeting and work aren't allowed to necessarily talk. We're not allowed to be there.
Mhm. Robin, we've started getting questions coming in from the audience, so I'm going to just jump in and start us off on that. And maybe
Great.
we'll go back to Leah on this one because I think it's probably something that you might want to answer. And that is Kathleen, who's listening in, watching, asks how much of the Canadian pension plan is invested in fossil fuels. Can divesting from those kinds of commitments be a part of the government's climate strategy?
Well, absolutely. And, in terms of like investing in pensions, there's lots of people who are choosing to ensure that all of the money that's invested in pensions goes into, for example, clean energy. I think certainly the government could play a big role in that, but I think realistically, we still have a government in place that's providing subsidies to the fossil fuel industry. This is not a government that's worried about, divesting pensions from investing in fossil fuels to other areas when they themselves, as a government, are using public monies to, subsidize a big oil and gas that certainly don't need subsidies right now, and yet we don't really see enough money in this budget for proper housing for folks. And just going back to what Robin had spoke about before, this woke, this whole woke, the woke people, certainly Pierre Poilievre, that's his new buzz term. Like, it's a bad thing to be woke. It's about woke being anti-racist. All those woke people. Well, I'm happy to be woke. I'm an anti-racist. I'm a climate justice activist. I'm a feminist. I speak up about reproductive rights, and I speak out against human rights violations. And that includes the violation of the fundamental right for human beings to have a clean, healthy, and safe environment. I put forward a bill in the last parliament to recognize a clean, healthy, and safe environment as a human right. But, going back to this government and certainly the official opposition right now, they're not interested in divesting from big oil and gas, whether it's public money or pension or other investments into pensions. Certainly something that I think we need to put a lot of pressure on the government to do the right thing, to divest from fossil fuels, to make big oil and gas pay, to make big corporations pay that are reaping benefits off destroying Mother Earth, violating the human rights, very often violating the human rights of Indigenous peoples around the country. They need to pay.
Mhm.
No, thanks, Leah. All right, this next question, I'm
I
pretty
just
sure.
shared something quickly in the chat. Like, I think Shift is an environmental organization that does a lot of work on divesting pension funds. So, I think what Leah was talking about is true, but there's different ways of looking at it.
Excellent, thanks, Diana. All right, another question from the audience. I think everyone's going to have something to say on, and that is, why isn't CAP's environmental role on the front page of every paper? This panel speaks to corporate capture, but what about media capture?
Yes, that's what we need to do, and I am trying to do this. Here we're having this debate about foreign election meddling. We've got to change that conversation to big foreign oil election meddling, because they are so much more influential. I'll give you an example. The royalty rate in Alberta, because Alberta has most of the oil in Canada, there were 6 big foreign-owned oil corporations in 1996 that basically wrote their own royalty regime. And then the Alberta government in Ottawa signed on to it. It's still in place. It is 15 times lower than the Norway's royalty rate. So Norway's been getting $70 a barrel in royalties. Alberta's been getting under $5 a barrel. So, not only is big oil subsidized, and they have made the record profit last year, higher than they have ever done, to a great extent because of the invasion of Ukraine and the price of oil going up. But the profits of the oil companies is so great that they are sending over $20 billion a year in profits right outside the country, because most of it isn't even owned in Canada, doesn't even touch down in the country.
Gordon, the question is about media. What's the media connection there?
When this sweetheart deal was done in 1996, the media reports didn't say that it was written by the oil companies themselves. And no one mentioned that, that it was the oil companies, and no one mentioned that these oil companies, none of them were Canadian owned. It was like they just said there was the oil industry called what they set up something they called a national task force. The oil companies, you think of a task force, national task force, as a government thing in the public interest. No, it was set up by the oil companies, and then the government bought into it. And the media wrote a report on this, didn't say anything about that.
Gotcha. I hear. Diana?
I know local independent media does a lot to support climate journalists and to amplify, yeah, like stories of climate action and indigenous resistance against fossil fuel projects. I guess it's I don't exactly know why, but I think that we are seeing more awareness of the climate crisis. So you would hope that it would it would show up in mainstream media, but it still doesn't necessarily do that. And I think part of that is, it can seem really like doomery to constantly be like, yeah, the world is burning. But, I think that the way, when I've kind of studied climate communications, it's important to not just say the world is burning. Yes, we just went through a spring heat wave, but this is the work that's happening, right? And if the work isn't happening to kind of tackle the climate crisis, then I don't think it's a doomery story to really be like, okay, like this is constantly holding our governments accountable for lack of action.
Mm-hmm.
We've got quite a few questions coming in, so we're going to try and get to more questions. But I did just want to note, I see that Browne, the managing editor at Rabble, has been posting polls every so often. This is actually a new feature on Off the Hill every month, and we're doing it sort of as a bit of an experiment because we want to liven the discussion, we want to engage people. So if you see that poll pop up, poll question, absolutely feel free to answer the poll, and I'm sure they'll keep appearing. So next question that's come up. This is for Diana and Leah. The person says, "Thank you for raising land defenders, Diana. I appreciate the solidarity actions, but how do we actually change government?" Pretty big question to Diana and Leah. What are your thoughts on where people should begin to do that?
Leah's in government, so maybe I'll give it to
Well,
her.
I'm not in government. I want to be
Not in
very
government,
clear.
so-
I'm an
Loyal
elected
opposition.
official.
The
Won't
loyal
take the
opposition.
blame.
Yeah.
Loyal opposition.
Yeah.
But so I think many people know prior to being elected, I was an advocate on the ground, including an advocate around pushing forward climate justice. And I have been involved in even, I would say, more modern, like I just turned 51 last weekend, in fact, but movements, I don't know, more like 2012. We really pushed, I believe, the climate agenda at that time. I don't think movements are just acts of resistance. I think they're political, become the political anchor to push for change. That belief, even now that I'm an elected official, has not changed. Governments, particularly, don't do things because it's the right thing to do. What I found is that things change at the federal level because of political pressure. This even includes issues around murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls. You can't separate the crisis of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls and the climate emergency. You cannot. They're interrelated. They are tied. The same violence we're perpetrating against our lands, same kind of violence we're seeing against Indigenous women and girls and Two-Spirit people, and many of the women that end up in urban centers that experience violence, sometimes resulting in death, are connected to lands that have been exploited and destroyed by resource development and extraction, including I want to give condolences to the family of Linda Marie Beardy. And although she didn't live in Lake St. Martin, that was one of the nations in Manitoba that received such horrendous flooding from Manitoba Hydro that they lost their home. They had no home to return to. So, I think boots to ground matter. I think it's the movement that's going to a powerful movement that's going to force political change in this country. And there's different movements happening, unfortunately. There's a movement that is fighting to uphold human rights and human dignity. And then we have a growing alt-right, white nationalist, extreme right movement that's brewing in this country. They also have a movement, and movement matters, and movements control the narrative. And now more than ever, it's important for progressives, real progressives, to get organized, to out-organize this alt-right movement that's taking hold in this country, that now many have found a place and home with the new leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre. We need to counter that narrative. We need to counter that narrative on the left, and we need to get organized. And so, we talk about what can we do for government? Well, it's movement. It's the land defenders. But we need to coalesce and come together, like in Ontario, the Ontario strike that almost happened. I almost canceled my trip that I had to take for Parliament to Thailand. I said, if they go on strike, I was an ECE. I am canceling. I don't care. I'm canceling. I'm going on the picket line. I'm going on the picket line. That pushed a right-wing Ontario government to pull back. So if we don't think movements matter, if we don't think that unions and the work that they're doing, shout out to PSAC, shout out to you, Robin, that is on the picket line right now. If we think those movements don't matter, we've lost. That's the change.
Anything you want to add, Diana, to those thoughts?
I think Leah and I share a very similar theory of change, kind of grassroots power and understanding the role of kind of citizens in the electoral system.
Okay, thanks.
All right, thanks. We might have a room for one more question, which is related to a story that's very much in the news, but I just wanted to add one thing on the, because we're talking about corporations, we're talking about media, and we kind of made reference to this, but right, some of the corporations involved in that big backlash, right, are like Google, Meta, i.e. Facebook, and Twitter, that are literally the platforms that are giving voice to the people who are leading the backlash and making tons of money doing it, right? So, and speaking of making tons of money, the question that we got from the audience is, hey, can you speak to Galen Weston's resignation? Is this a win or another corporate cover-up? Who wants to take that one?
It doesn't
Well,
sound.
Oh, sorry.
It doesn't sound very significant to me. It sounds like he's still owner of the company. He's going to make all the big bucks. He's still chair of the board. And so he's got a new president of Loblaws. I mean, but he's still the head of the parent company. So, it's just, I think it's window dressing and sort of moving around players. They are still making a lot of money, gouging consumers. He was born into this, this is like, this is the old rich establishment in Canada. So I think it's, again, just window dressing.
I just want to go back to what you said, Robin, about Twitter. Like, Pierre Poilievre is going after the CBC like nobody's business, and I have my theories about it. But let's be clear about Pierre Poilievre. He's never needed the media. He's used social media. He's now fraternizing with Elon Musk, who is the biggest social media giant in the world right now. Fraternizing with them. It is absolutely horrifying. So I think you're absolutely right, Robin. Like when you look at the rise of the alt-right, they have a lot of support from folks like Elon Musk. And I don't think Elon Musk is very progressive. Let me tell you, he's shared his views pretty clearly, and I know where he sits on the political spectrum. But in terms of Galen Weston, I mean he's one person amongst a number of corporate giants that are benefiting off the misery of everybody else. They need to pay their fair share. The fact that they get it, like Elon Musk, you have Amazon, Bezos, Jeff Bezos. I mean, like, he's one of many, and we just need to really be I think vigilant at this time how much actual power they have. We need to be mindful and vigilant, and we need to push back, and we need to name it and call it out. But governments are also responsible. There's no real regulations being put in place to protect people living in Canada. There's no real regulations that are substantial enough to deal with what we're dealing with right now, from my perspective.
I'm going to try and jump in with just one last question to Diana, actually. This is a question that came in from Annette, who asks, how can we take a 7-generation approach to the climate crisis when governments think in a 4-year cycle and corporations in quarterly earnings report?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question.
Yeah,
No, for sure.
Yeah.
I think what matters is, knowing that the campaigns you have should not just be directed to one electoral cycle. I know that, the activists that I work with believe, yes, hopefully the politicians we elect are ones that were willing to be swayed, to listen to communities, the grassroots movements. But ultimately, they are also part of a political system that is not designed to want to really, like Leah said, right? Like, you would hope that that's what governments do, is do the right thing, but that's not always the case. So, I look to, when you make campaigns, like it, if the campaign is just like fire Galen Weston or fire John Tory, what does that achieve? Will someone else come in that is going to do essentially the same thing, and I think that that's why I think about like building campaigns that can it increase the strength and size of Indigenous jurisdictions? Can it reduce emissions? Can it improve conditions for working people? Who's impacted? I think it's a big questions around strategy and campaign building to ensure that work outside of the political system, but hope that political insiders support your causes if you're loud and build enough of a mass movement.
All right. Thanks, Diana. Well, that is all the time we have today. So thanks to MP Leah Gazan, Diana Yoon, and Gordon Laxer for another great conversation. Our live political panel, Off the Hill, will return on May 24th. So be sure you get an invitation for that event by signing up for Rabble's newsletter at rabble.ca/subscribe. And finally, thank you, Rabble for creating a space to host these important discussions. And on that note, we'd like again to wish Rabble a happy birthday. This week, Rabble is celebrating 22 years of sharing progressive news and views. In honor of Rabble's 22nd anniversary, Rabble is offering special gifts for new subscribers. Becoming a monthly donor helps Rabble keep delivering quality, independent journalism 365 days a year. No amount is too little. Join the birthday celebration, become a Rabble rouser, and make a donation at rabble.ca/donate today. Thank you all for joining us, and see you May 24th.
Thanks, Robin. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.